Hey there! Tonight we journey to a different time and a different world. We leave behind the familiar histories of kings and empires, of cowboys and gunslingers, and travel back to the vast open grasslands of the northern plains, to a time before the prairies were carved by fences and roads. We are going to live for a time within a Native American clan, among the great horse nations, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Crow. Forget the simplistic images of a wandering primitive life. We are stepping into a civilization that was deeply complex, profoundly communal, and ingeniously synchronized with the rhythm of the bison and the turning of the seasons. This is not a story of constant warfare or dramatic showdowns. It is a story of the quiet, rhythmic, and deeply meaningful tasks that made up a life. It's about the smell of sage and sweetgrass on the wind, the feel of a soft, brain-tanned bison hide in your hands, the sound of 100 tipi flaps fluttering in unison, and the sight of a sky so vast it touches the horizon in every direction. It's about understanding a world where the sacred and the mundane were not separate things, but were woven together into a single, intricate tapestry of existence. If this kind of slow, detailed, and contemplative history helps you to quiet your mind and find a measure of peace, I would be grateful if you would like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if these stories genuinely bring you some rest. And as always, I love to see our community of listeners. Please, feel free to leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. There's a unique comfort in knowing we are all settling in together. So, dim your lights. Turn on a fan for that soft, ambient hum if you find it soothing. Get comfortable, and let's step through a doorway in time, into the heart of the great grasslands, and into a life that was governed by the sun, the herds, and the unyielding bonds of kinship. Let's start by recalibrating your mental map. When you picture the northern plains of the 18th or 19th century, the vast expanse that would one day become the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming, and parts of Canada, what do you see? For most of us, thanks to cinematic conditioning, the image is one of emptiness. A sweeping, majestic, but fundamentally vacant landscape. A wild, untamed wilderness, waiting to be discovered, settled, and civilized. This is perhaps the single greatest misconception, the foundational error upon which all other misunderstandings are built. That land was not empty. It was full. It was pulsing with life, crisscrossed by ancient trails, and meticulously, if invisibly, mapped in the minds of its people. It was a landscape of nations, of territories, of sacred sites, of trade routes, of political alliances, and long-standing rivalries. To think of it as empty is like looking at a map of modern Europe and seeing only fields and rivers, completely ignoring the borders, the capitals, the languages, and the history that give it meaning. The peoples of the plains of the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Blackfoot, the Arapaho, the Kiowa, and many others did not wander aimlessly across this space. Their movements were a finely tuned choreography, dictated by the seasons, the behavior of the bison, the availability of resources, and generations of accumulated knowledge. A particular river valley wasn't just a pretty spot, it was the ideal place for a winter camp, sheltered from the wind and with plenty of cottonwood trees whose bark could feed the horses when the snow was deep. A certain set of hills wasn't just a landmark, it was a sacred site for a vision quest, a place where the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin. Imagine a modern city dweller being dropped into the middle of Manhattan. To them, it's a chaotic, overwhelming mess of concrete and noise. But to a local, every street, every neighborhood, every subway line has a name, a purpose, a history, and a reputation. The plains were no different. The Lakota, for example, had names for every creek, every butte, every significant feature of their homeland, the He-Sapa, or Black Hills. This wasn't just geography, it was a living, breathing narrative. A particular creek might be called Where the Young Man Counted His First Coup, a name that was both a map marker and a history lesson, a constant reminder of a past event and the values it embodied. This mental map was a piece of intellectual property far more valuable than any physical object. It told you where to find the best chokecherries in late summer, which river crossings were treacherous in the spring melt, where rival war parties were likely to be encountered, and where the great bison herds would be moving in the autumn. This knowledge wasn't written in books, it was inscribed in memory, passed down through stories, songs, and direct experience. It was a dynamic, constantly updated database that ensured the survival and prosperity of the people. Furthermore, the land was not a single monolithic territory. It was a complex quilt of overlapping uses and sovereignties. The Crow, for instance, were known for their mastery of the mountainous terrain of what is now Montana and Wyoming, a territory rich in game and strategically important. Their neighbors, the Lakota and Cheyenne, were masters of the open plains, their society built around the massive bison herds. These territories were not static. They shifted and flowed based on treaties, warfare, and changing environmental conditions. A river might serve as a recognized boundary between two nations for a generation, only to become a contested zone in the next. These weren't lawless lands. They were governed by a complex and often delicate system of international diplomacy, a system that European and American newcomers completely failed to comprehend, dismissing it all as primitive squabbling. The idea of the empty wilderness was a convenient fiction. It was a legal and moral justification for an agenda of expansion. If a land is empty, then taking it isn't conquest, it's settlement, it's improvement. But the land was not empty, it was home. It was a landscape saturated with meaning, history, and life. And to understand the people who lived there, we must first abandon this foundational myth and see the plains not as a blank canvas, but as a finished, intricate, and ancient masterpiece. We just need to learn how to see the brushstrokes. If you wanted to understand the engine that drove plain society, you wouldn't look for a king, a congress, or a courthouse. You would look at the family. But not family in the way a modern suburbanite understands it, a tight little nuclear unit of 2 parents and 2.5 kids rattling around in a house with a white picket fence. No, this was family as a sprawling, all-encompassing, life-sustaining ecosystem. It was the social, political, and economic operating system, and it was called kinship. For the Lakota, the fundamental unit was the tioshpai, a word that translates loosely as extended family group. But extended family barely scratches the surface. Imagine your family. Now add in all your aunts, uncles, first cousins, second cousins, third cousins you've never met, your great-grandparents, siblings, descendants, and then several other families who decided to link up with yours for mutual support a few generations back. Now imagine you all live together, travel together, work together, and are collectively responsible for one another's well-being. That begins to approach the concept of the tioshpai. This wasn't just a sentimental arrangement, it was the absolute bedrock of survival. In a world without formal insurance policies, police departments, or social security, your kin were your everything. They were your safety net, your defense force, your education system, and your retirement plan, all rolled into one. If your tipi burned down, your relatives would help you build a new one. If your hunt was unsuccessful, your cousins would share their meat. If you were sick, your aunts would care for you. If you were wronged by someone from another band, your entire tioshpai would stand with you to seek justice. The bonds of kinship dictated nearly every social interaction. The most powerful relationship was not between husband and wife, but often between brother and sister, or between an uncle and his nephews. A maternal uncle, for instance, often had a more direct role in a boy's upbringing and training than the boy's own father. This created a web of overlapping obligations and affections that distributed responsibility and strengthened the group. This system also had its own complex etiquette, a social grammar that everyone knew instinctively. For example, in many plains cultures, there was a strict avoidance taboo between a man and his mother-in-law. They were not to speak to each other, look directly at each other, or even be in the same teepee alone. From a modern perspective, this sounds bizarre, like the setup for a bad sitcom. But it was a brilliant piece of social engineering. It was a formal mechanism to prevent the kind of in-law friction and household conflict that could destabilize a family unit. By making the relationship one of extreme, formalized respect, it short-circuited any potential for casual familiarity to breed contempt. It was a firewall against domestic drama. Being without kin, an orphan, or an outcast was the most terrifying fate imaginable. It was to be truly alone and vulnerable, a ghost in a world built on connection. For this reason, adoption was incredibly common and fluid. A child whose parents had died would be instantly absorbed into the teepee of an aunt or a grandmother. A captive taken in a raid might be adopted into a family to replace a deceased member, eventually becoming a full-fledged part of the clan. The goal was always to weave people in, not cast them out. The strength of the tioshpai, and by extension the entire nation, depended on the strength and number of its threads. So when we talk about a clan or a band on the northern plains, we're not talking about a simple collection of individuals. We're talking about a massive, interconnected biological and social organism. The individual had identity and purpose, but it was always understood in relation to the whole. Your successes brought honor to your kin. Your failures brought them shame. It was a system that demanded immense loyalty and responsibility, but in return, it offered something that has become vanishingly rare in the modern world: the absolute certainty that you belonged. You were part of something vast, ancient, and enduring, and you would never, ever have to face the world alone. If you've ever struggled with a modern dome tent, fumbling with fiberglass poles and indecipherable instructions while the wind threatens to turn the whole thing into a kite, you might appreciate the sheer genius of the tipi. To call it a tent is a profound understatement. It's like calling a cathedral a big room. The tipi wasn't just a shelter. It was a marvel of engineering, a piece of sophisticated mobile architecture, a sacred space, and the functional and spiritual heart of the Plains family. Let's get this out of the way first. The tipi you see in movies, a perfect, symmetrical cone, is a caricature. The classic Plains tipi was actually tilted. It was an asymmetrical cone, with the back being steeper and the front having a gentler slope. This wasn't an accident or a design flaw, it was a brilliant adaptation to the environment. The steep back braced the structure against the relentless westerly winds of the Great Plains, while the longer, sloped front created more usable headroom inside, away from the central fire. It was aerodynamics and ergonomics combined in a single, elegant design. The foundation consisted of a tripod of 3 or 4 primary poles, chosen for their strength and straightness. The rest of the lodge poles, sometimes as many as 20, were then laid against this stable base. Think of it as a skeleton of lightweight, flexible bone. The entire structure could be erected by a skilled team, usually the women of the household, in under an hour, and it could be disassembled and packed onto a horse-drawn travois in even less time. This wasn't just a home. It was the world's first truly successful mobile home, perfectly adapted to a semi-nomadic lifestyle. The skin of the tipi was its crowning achievement. It was a single, massive covering made from anywhere between 8 and 20 tanned bison hides, meticulously stitched together with sinew. Tanning these hides was an arduous, highly skilled process performed by women, and a woman's reputation often rested on her ability to produce fine, supple, and waterproof hides. The sinew thread used for sewing had a unique property. When it got wet, it swelled, effectively sealing the needle holes and making the seams watertight. It was a natural form of Gore-Tex. But the real genius lay in the climate control system. At the top of the teepee were 2 large flaps, often called smoke flaps or ears, each controlled by its own long pole reaching down to the ground. These weren't just for letting smoke out. By adjusting the position of the flaps relative to the wind, you could create a powerful draft that would pull smoke from the central fire straight up and out, no matter which way the wind was blowing. In the summer, you could open them wide to vent hot air, creating a natural cooling effect. In the winter, you could close them tight to conserve warmth. Furthermore, the hide cover didn't reach all the way to the ground. There was a gap at the bottom, and often an inner lining of hides, called a dewcloth or ozan, was hung around the inside perimeter. This created a convection current. Cool, fresh air was drawn in from under the outer cover, flowed up between the lining and the cover, and pushed the smoke up and out through the smoke flaps. This system provided constant ventilation without creating a draft on the people inside. It was a natural, passive HVAC system that would make a modern architect weep with admiration. The tipi was also a sacred space, a microcosm of the universe. The floor represented the earth, the walls represented the sky, and the poles were the pathways connecting the earth to the spirit world. The circular shape represented the cyclical nature of life, the sun, the moon, and the horizon. The fire at the center was the heartbeat of the home, providing warmth, light, and a place to cook and gather. The space inside was organized and orderly. The place of honor was at the back, opposite the door, reserved for the head of the household or an honored guest. One side of the fire was generally considered the man's domain, where he kept his weapons and sacred items. The other side was the woman's, where she kept her cooking utensils and sewing kits. Furnishings consisted of comfortable backrests made of willow rods, soft bison hide robes for bedding, and beautifully decorated rawhide containers, like suitcases called parfleches for storing food, clothing, and supplies. So, the tipi was far more than a simple cone of sticks and hide. It was a high-performance, climate-controlled, portable, and sacred dwelling. It was a product of generations of research and development, a perfect fusion of form and function. It was a machine for living, and it stands as one of the most sophisticated and elegant architectural solutions ever devised by humankind. To understand the peoples of the Northern Plains, you must first understand their relationship with a single animal, the American bison. To say the bison was important is a laughable understatement. The bison was everything. It was the foundation of the economy, the source of food, shelter, and tools, and the center of the spiritual universe. It wasn't just a resource, it was a divine gift, a partner in the great dance of existence. The entire rhythm of life, the seasonal migrations, the social gatherings, the spiritual ceremonies was synchronized to the movements of the great herds. Calling this the bison economy isn't just a catchy phrase, it's the literal truth. The bison was a walking, breathing department store, a four-legged Walmart that provided everything a person could possibly need. Let's do a little inventory. First, and most obviously, there was the meat. A single large bull could provide hundreds of pounds of fresh meat, which was roasted, boiled, or most importantly, preserved. Women were the masters of meat preservation, slicing it into thin sheets and drying it on racks in the sun and wind to create jerky. This jerky could last for months, providing a reliable source of protein through the lean winter months. Even more nutritious was pemmican, a high-energy superfood that was the original protein bar. It was made by pounding the dried meat into a powder, mixing it with melted fat, and adding crushed chokecherries or other berries for flavor and vitamins. Packed into rawhide bags, pemmican was lightweight, incredibly durable, and could last for years. It was the perfect travel food, the fuel for war parties, trade expeditions, and long migrations. But the meat was just the beginning. The hide, as we've seen, was the primary building material for the tipi cover. Thick hides from the neck and shoulders of old bulls were used to make tough war shields, so strong they could deflect an arrow. Softer, tanned hides from cows and calves were used for clothing dresses, leggings, shirts, and moccasins, and for warm, luxurious robes that served as both blankets and overcoats. Rawhide, which was untanned hide, scraped clean and dried until it was stiff and hard, was the plains equivalent of plastic and plywood. It was used to make ropes, drumheads, containers like the parfleche, and even the soles of moccasins. The bones were a toolkit. A shoulder blade, lashed to a stick, became a hoe for gardening or a scraper for tanning hides. Ribs could be used as runners for small sleds for children. Other bones were fashioned into knives, arrowheads, awls, and needles. The horns were carved into spoons, ladles, and decorative cups. They could also be steamed and straightened to make powerful bows. The skull, often with the horns attached, was a powerful spiritual object, used in ceremonies as a symbol of the sacred bond between the people and the bison nation. Even the internal organs were used. The stomach and bladder could be cleaned and used as watertight containers, the original canteens. The sinew, the long tendons running along the backbone, was the world's best thread. It was strong, flexible, and as we saw with the tipi, it swelled when wet, making it perfect for sewing waterproof seams. The hooves were boiled down to make glue. The beard was used to decorate clothing and weapons. The tail became a fly whisk. The buffalo chips, the dried dung, were a crucial source of fuel on the largely treeless plains. They burned hot and with very little smoke, making them ideal for a cooking fire inside a tipi. Literally nothing was wasted. To waste any part of the bison was considered a profound act of disrespect, a violation of the sacred contract. The hunt itself was not a sport. It was a carefully planned, highly organized, and deeply spiritual undertaking. Before a major hunt, ceremonies were held to ask for the bison's blessing, to honor its spirit, and to ensure success. The hunt was often policed by members of a warrior society, who made sure no one started early and scared the herd, ensuring the entire community would benefit. The relationship was one of reciprocity. The people took what they needed from the bison, and in return, they offered respect, gratitude, and ceremonies to ensure the herds would remain strong and plentiful. The bison gave its body so the people could live. This wasn't just an economic transaction. It was a sacred covenant that formed the very heart of plains culture. Forget the frantic, clock-driven, notification-punctuated chaos of modern life. A day on the plains was governed by a different clock. The sun, the seasons, and the needs of the community. It was a rhythm of focused work, social interaction, and leisurely stillness, a balance that we, in our hyper-productive age, might find both alien and deeply enviable. Let's walk through a hypothetical day in a summer camp, a bustling temporary city of several hundred tipis arranged in a great circle. The day would begin just before dawn. The first to stir would often be the older men and women, rising to greet the sun with prayers and offerings of tobacco or sweetgrass. There was no jarring alarm clock, only the gentle greying of the eastern sky and the changing sounds of the camp. As the sun's first rays touched the tops of the tipis, the camp would begin to wake. The sound of dogs barking, the low murmur of voices, and the chopping of wood would slowly build into a quiet hum of activity. For a woman, the morning work began almost immediately. She would rekindle the central fire, fetch water from the nearby creek in a hide bucket, and begin preparing the morning meal, perhaps some boiled jerky, fresh meat from a recent hunt, or a stew of preserved vegetables and roots. This wasn't a solitary chore. Her sisters, cousins, and daughters would be doing the same in the neighboring teepees, and the work was often communal. Women would gather at the creek, sharing news and gossip as they filled their water bags. After the morning meal, the camp would diverge into its daily tasks. For the men, this might mean a variety of things. A group of younger men might be heading out on a small hunting party to look for deer or antelope to supplement the larder. Older men might gather in a shady spot to repair their weapons, fletch arrows, or carve a new pipe, their hands busy while their minds were engaged in conversation, politics, or strategy. A man's prestige didn't just come from bravery in battle, but also from his skill as a craftsman and his wisdom in council. There was no retirement on the plains. Elders were the living libraries of the people, and their counsel was sought on all important matters. For the women, the post-breakfast hours were the core of their economic workday. This was the time for processing resources. If a bison hunt had recently concluded, the camp would be a whirlwind of female industry. Some women would be scraping hides, a physically demanding job that required skill and strength. Others would be cutting meat into thin strips for drying. Still others might be tending to their small gardens of corn, squash, and beans if their particular nation practiced horticulture. Perhaps the most visible and prestigious work was decorative craft. A woman might spend her afternoon meticulously working with porcupine quills, which she would flatten, dye with natural pigments, and embroider onto a shirt or a pair of moccasins in intricate geometric patterns. This wasn't just a hobby, it was a demonstration of her skill, patience, and artistic vision. A woman known for her fine quill work, or later beadwork, was a woman of high status, an artist whose work brought beauty and prestige to her entire family. Her creations were her portfolio, her resume, and her art gallery all in one. Children were not shuffled off to school or daycare. They were fully integrated into the life of the camp. They learned by watching, listening, and doing. Young boys would have miniature bows and would practice shooting at targets, mimicking the actions of their fathers and uncles. They would learn to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Young girls would help their mothers with chores, learning how to sew, cook, and tan hides with small tools made just for them. Their play was their education. Games of tag taught agility. Games of playing house in miniature tipis taught domestic roles and responsibilities. There was no sharp division between work, play, and learning. As the afternoon sun began to dip, the pace would slow. The hunters would return, and the results of their efforts would be shared throughout their tioshpai. The evening meal would be a major social event. Families would eat, but often there was visiting between tipis. A man might invite his brother-in-law to share his pipe. Women might gather to finish a collective project. And as darkness fell, and the campfires glowed like a constellation on the prairie, the day would end as it began, with community. This was the time for storytelling. An elder would hold the camp spellbound with tales of the trickster, Iktomai, or epic histories of the people's migrations and great battles. These stories were not just entertainment, they were the constitution, the history books, and the moral compass of the people, teaching the next generation what it meant to be brave, generous, humble, and a good relative. As the stories wound down and the embers of the fire died, people would retire to their tipis, to the warmth of the bison robes, their sleep filled not with anxieties about the next day's schedule, but with the deep, collective peace of a community in harmony with its world. Let's dismantle one of the most persistent and damaging stereotypes of Native American life. The image of the woman as a downtrodden beast, of burden, a squaw who did all the work while the men lounged around. This image is a fiction, a projection of the patriarchal values of the white observers who first wrote about Plains life. The reality is that women were the backbone of the Plains economy, held significant social power, and were the literal owners of the household. To put it in modern terms, she wasn't just a resident of the home, she was the CEO, the property owner, and the chief operating officer. First, let's talk about economic power. A woman owned the tipi. It was hers. She and her female relatives had likely procured and prepared the poles, and she had certainly tanned and sewn the dozens of bison hides that made up its cover. A man might be the nominal head of household, but he was in essence a guest in his wife's home. If a marriage dissolved and divorce was a relatively simple and common affair, the man walked away with his personal possessions, his weapons, his sacred bundle, his horse. The woman kept the tipi, the children, and all the household goods she had created or accumulated. This right of property gave her immense leverage and independence. She was not a dependent, she was a homeowner. Her economic role went far beyond property ownership. As we've discussed, women were the masters of production. They were the butchers, the tanners, the tailors, the chefs, the horticulturalists, and the engineers. While a man's primary economic contribution was providing the raw material, the bisonette was the woman who transformed that raw material into every single usable good: food, shelter, clothing, tools. A man who was a great hunter but was married to a lazy or unskilled woman would be poor. His piles of raw hides and meat would rot before they could be turned into wealth. Conversely, a highly skilled and industrious woman could turn even a mediocre hunter's provisions into a comfortable and prestigious lifestyle. Her labor was the engine of the entire economy. This economic power translated directly into social influence. While men dominated the formal, public political sphere speaking in council, leading war parties' women wielded considerable power behind the scenes. Important men would consult their wives, sisters, and mothers before making major decisions. A woman's opinion mattered. Furthermore, women's societies and guilds existed, creating female power structures that operated in parallel to the men's. These groups controlled certain ceremonies, held specialized knowledge, and provided a forum for women to exert collective influence on the community. And then there was the realm of art and aesthetics, which was almost entirely a female domain. The stunningly beautiful geometric designs found in Plains quillwork and beadwork were not just decorations, they were a visual language of identity, status, and spiritual power. A woman's ability to create beautiful things was a direct reflection of her character and her connection to the sacred. A well-made, beautifully decorated tipi, a finely quilled shirt, or a perfectly crafted pair of moccasins were all public statements of the skill and good character of the woman who made them. It was the Plains equivalent of a high-fashion brand, a luxury car, and a PhD thesis all rolled into one. Young women aspired to be masters of this craft, and their work was judged by the elder women with a critical eye. It was a formal system of art, with its own rules, traditions, and recognized masters. Spiritually, women also held crucial roles. While some ceremonies were male-dominated, many others required the participation of women, and some were controlled entirely by them. Women could be healers, herbalists, and dreamers who brought powerful visions to the people. In many Plains creation stories, it is a female figure, white buffalo calf woman for the Lakota who brings the most sacred laws and ceremonies to the people. This placed the feminine principle at the very heart of their spiritual understanding of the world. So, far from being a voiceless drudge, the Plains woman was an economic powerhouse, a property owner, a skilled artisan, and a respected voice in her community. She worked hard. Yes, everyone worked hard, but her work was recognized as essential and highly valued. Her world was not one of oppression, but one of partnership. A society where male and female roles were different but complementary, like two wings of an eagle, both necessary for the people to soar. When we hear the term warrior society, our minds immediately jump to images of violent, aggressive military units focused solely on combat. And while warfare was certainly a part of their duties, thinking of Plains warrior societies as just an army is like thinking of a modern university as just a collection of classrooms. It misses the vast majority of what they were and what they did. These societies were a combination of a police force, a board of public works, a social club, a charitable organization, and yes, a military regiment. They were the civic glue that held the larger camp together. Most Plains nations had several different warrior societies, each with its own unique name, songs, dances, regalia, and specific responsibilities. A young man didn't just become a warrior, he would, after proving his bravery and character, be invited to join a specific society, like the Kit Foxes, the Strong Hearts, the Dog Soldiers of the Cheyenne, or the Crow Owners of the Lakota. This was a tremendous honor, akin to being tapped for an elite fraternity or a prestigious civic organization. It marked his full transition into manhood and public responsibility. One of the most important roles of these societies was policing the community. Not policing in the modern sense of enforcing abstract laws, but in the sense of maintaining order and ensuring the well-being of the people. Their most critical police function was during the communal bison hunt. A successful hunt required absolute discipline. If a single eager individual charged the herd too early, he could scatter the bison for miles, jeopardizing the food supply for the entire village for the coming winter. To prevent this, members of a designated warrior society would patrol the camp, and they had absolute authority. They could verbally reprimand, physically strike, or even destroy the property of any man who broke the rules. This wasn't seen as tyranny. It was seen as a necessary measure to protect the common good. They also served as the camp's security force. When the large village was on the move, members of a society would scout ahead, guard the flanks, and protect the rear, ensuring the safety of the women, children, and elders. In camp, they acted as sentinels, watching for enemies or any other danger. Beyond these practical duties, the societies were the primary drivers of social life for men. Each society had its own tipi in the camp circle, which served as its clubhouse. Here, men would gather to smoke, feast, tell stories, and sing their society's songs. These gatherings built incredible camaraderie and a fierce sense of loyalty, an esprit de corps that was vital both in peacetime and in battle. They held dances and public ceremonies that added color and pageantry to camp life, and often engaged in friendly rivalries with other societies, competing in games or acts of generosity. Generosity, in fact, was a core tenet of every warrior society. A warrior was expected to be brave, but he was also expected to be magnanimous, especially towards the poor, the widowed, and the orphaned. A society would often take collective responsibility for caring for the most vulnerable members of the tribe. A successful war party returning with captured horses wouldn't just enrich its own members, they would be expected to give many of their new horses away, announcing the names of the widows or poor families they were honoring with their gifts. This was a fundamental part of gaining prestige. Hoarding wealth was seen as contemptible. True status came from what you gave away. Of course, there was the warrior part. When the time came for battle, whether a defensive action or an offensive raid against a rival tribe, these societies formed the organized fighting force. Raiding was a common aspect of Plains life, but it wasn't the total war we think of today. It was often a limited affair, more like a high-stakes competitive sport, focused on capturing horses, the primary measure of wealth, and on acts of individual bravery. The ultimate act of bravery was not killing an enemy, but counting coup. To count coup was to touch a living, armed enemy with your hand, a bow, or a special coup stick, and get away unharmed. It was an act of supreme courage, skill, and bravado. It was considered far more prestigious to count coup on an enemy than to kill him from a distance with an arrow. A warrior's reputation was built on a hierarchy of deeds, counting a first coup, a second coup, capturing a horse from within an enemy camp, leading a successful war party. After a battle, warriors would publicly recount their deeds, which had to be verified by witnesses. This system channeled aggression into a framework that prized courage and skill over indiscriminate killing. So, these societies were far more than just military units. They were the essential civic institutions of Plains life. They maintained order, provided security, fostered community, organized social events, cared for the needy, and defined the very concept of what it meant to be a man. They were the living embodiment of the idea that true strength is measured not just by what you can do for yourself, but by what you do for your people. In a society without a written legal code, without prisons, without lawyers or judges in black robes, how was order maintained? How were disputes settled and crimes punished? The Western mind, accustomed to a system of abstract laws and punitive justice, often assumes the answer is not very well. We imagine a chaotic world ruled by brute force, where the strongest simply took what they wanted. But the reality was a sophisticated system of customary law and social control that was in many ways more effective and more humane than our own. The goal was not to punish the offender, but to restore harmony to the community. It was the original restorative justice. The entire system was built on a single powerful foundation: the pressure to maintain a good reputation within your kinship group. In a small, face-to-face society, where your survival and well-being depended entirely on your relationships with your relatives, public opinion was the ultimate enforcement mechanism. Being known as a thief, a liar, a coward, or a troublemaker was a social death sentence. It could lead to ostracism, ridicule, and a loss of status that was far more terrifying than any jail cell. The desire to be seen as a good, honorable, and generous relative was the primary force that kept most people in line. But what happened when someone did step out of line? Let's say a man, in a fit of anger, steals a horse from his neighbor within the same camp. There would be no 911 call, no police report. The news would travel through the camp's gossip network, a highly efficient information superhighway. The victim would make his grievance known, and soon everyone would know what had happened. At this point, the elders and respected leaders of the camp, particularly the chiefs of the two men's tioshpes, would step in. Their role was not to act as judges, but as mediators. Their first goal was to de-escalate the situation and prevent a violent feud from erupting between the two families. They would visit the offender, not to yell at him, but to talk to him, to shame him gently, to remind him of his obligations to his kin and his community. They would appeal to his better nature, pointing out the disharmony his actions had caused. "Look what you have done," they might say. "You have made your relatives hang their heads in shame. You have made your neighbor's heart bad. This is not the way a good man behaves." The focus was on repairing the damage. The solution was not to lock the man up, but to have him make things right. He would be expected to return the stolen horse, but that wasn't enough. Just returning the property didn't heal the broken relationship or the insult. To truly restore harmony, he would have to go further. He might be advised to return the stolen horse and give the victim one of his own best horses as a gesture of apology and remorse. He might also be expected to publicly apologize, or to offer the victim a ceremonial pipe to smoke, a powerful symbol of making peace. The entire process was about reintegrating the offender back into the community fabric. The crime was seen as a tear in that fabric, and the goal was to mend it. Punishing the offender by casting him out or locking him away would only make the tear bigger. By guiding him through a process of apology, restitution, and reconciliation, the community could be made whole again. Of course, for more serious crimes, the consequences were more severe. A murder within the tribe was the most heinous crime imaginable, as it created a rift that was almost impossible to heal. In some cases, the family of the victim had the right to seek blood revenge, though the leaders would do everything in their power to prevent this by arranging for a massive payment of blood wealth, a huge transfer of horses and goods from the offender's family to the victim's family to cover the body and prevent a multi-generational feud. In other cases, the murderer might be exiled from the tribe, either for a period of years or for life. This was considered a fate worse than death, to be cut off from your kin and left to wander the world alone. This system wasn't perfect, but it was remarkably effective. It was rooted in the understanding that human beings are social creatures who crave belonging and respect. It recognized that a crime hurts not just the victim, but the entire community, and that justice should be about healing, not just hurting. It's a philosophy that our own modern legal system, with its overflowing prisons and high rates of recidivism, is only just beginning to rediscover. How do you create a competent, knowledgeable, and well-adjusted adult without schools, without grades, without textbooks, and without a single pop quiz? The peoples of the plains had a simple and profound answer. You immerse them in the world they need to master, and you let them learn by living. Childhood was not a segregated period of life spent in institutions. It was a long, rich apprenticeship in the art of being human. From the moment they were born, children were at the center of the community. They were cherished, doted upon, and rarely, if ever, struck. The concept of corporal punishment was largely alien. The primary tools of discipline were praise, gentle ridicule, and storytelling. A child learned correct behavior because they craved the approval of their relatives and feared the shame of being publicly teased for being lazy or selfish. The curriculum was life itself. A young girl didn't take a home economics class. She sat beside her mother, grandmother, and aunts. and was given small pieces of hide to scrape, a blunt awl to practice sewing with, and miniature parfleche boxes to decorate. She learned the complex art of tanning, the subtle techniques of quillwork, and the vast catalogue of edible and medicinal plants by watching and doing, her small hands mimicking the skilled movements of her elders. Her failures were not graded with an F, but were gently corrected, and her successes were praised, building her confidence and skill incrementally. Similarly, a young boy's education took place at the heels of his male relatives. His first toy would be a miniature bow. He and his friends would spend endless hours in play that was in fact rigorous training. They would hold shooting competitions, hunt for small birds and rabbits, and stage mock battles. These games taught them not just the mechanics of archery, but also the arts of stalking, teamwork, and strategy. He learned to ride a horse almost before he could walk, developing a level of equestrian skill that was legendary. He learned the names and uses of hundreds of plants and animals, not by memorizing a textbook, but by walking the land with his father or uncle, who would point things out and tell him their stories. The role of grandparents was especially crucial. Elders were the repositories of knowledge, the living encyclopedias of the tribe. With their primary working years behind them, they had the time and patience to devote to the children. A grandmother might spend her days with her granddaughters, teaching them the intricate patterns of beadwork and telling them the stories associated with each design. A grandfather would gather the young boys around the fire and tell them the great epic tales of their people, the stories of their heroes, the history of their migrations, and the moral lessons embedded in the adventures of the trickster spirits. These stories were not just entertainment, they were the core of their humanities, education, teaching history, ethics, theology, and law in a form that was engaging and memorable. The entire community was the faculty. A child could learn from any adult. If a boy showed a particular aptitude for making bows, a man in the camp known for his skill as a bowyer might take him under his wing as an informal apprentice. If a girl had a powerful dream, she would be taken to a respected holy woman to help her understand its meaning. Education was decentralized, personalized, and deeply relational. The goal of this system was not to produce a person who could pass a standardized test, but to produce a person who was competent, generous, brave, and a good relative. The final exam was life itself. Could you provide for your family? Could you live in harmony with your kin? Did you know how to behave with humility and respect? Did you honor the sacred traditions? These were the measures of a truly educated person. It was a holistic system that understood that learning is not about accumulating information, but about becoming a complete and valuable human being, fully integrated into the social and spiritual world of your people. To talk about religion on the plains is to immediately use the wrong word. Religion, in the modern sense, is often a compartment of life. You go to church on Sunday, you read your holy book, and you practice your faith at designated times and places. For the peoples of the plains, spirituality wasn't a compartment, it was the air they breathed. It was the operating system for reality itself, a lens through which every single thing, every rock, every animal, every gust of wind, every dream was understood. At the core of this worldview was the concept of interconnectedness. The Lakota called the ultimate divine force Wakang Ti Anka, which is often translated as Great Spirit, but a more accurate translation might be Great Mystery or Great Sacredness. It was not an anthropomorphic man in the sky deity who issued commandments. It was an impersonal, all-pervading sacred power that infused the entire universe. Every single thing was a manifestation of this power, and was therefore sacred and interconnected. The bison, the eagle, the stone, the humanal were relatives. All were part of the same cosmic family, all were animated by the same mysterious force. This belief wasn't an abstract philosophical idea, it shaped every action. When a hunter killed a bison, he would often pause to thank its spirit for giving its life. When a woman gathered medicinal herbs, she would leave an offering of tobacco and take only what she needed, recognizing she was in a relationship of reciprocity with the plant nation. There was no clear dividing line between the natural and the supernatural. The world was alive, conscious, and constantly communicating with those who knew how to listen. Dreams and visions were a primary channel of this communication. They were not seen as random neural firings, but as direct messages from the spirit world. A powerful dream could guide a person's entire life, bestowing upon them a special name, a sacred song, or instructions for a particular ceremony. For a young person coming of age, one of the most important life events was the Hangdulcheya, or crying for a vision, the vision quest. A young man or woman, under the guidance of a holy man, would go alone to a remote, high place, fasting from food and water for several days, praying and humbling themselves before the great mystery in the hope of receiving a vision that would guide their path in life. This was the most personal and direct form of spiritual experience, a direct dialogue between the individual and the sacred powers of the universe. Community ceremonies were the other pillar of spiritual life. The most significant of these was the Wiwangyang Wachipi, the sun dance. The name is misleading, and the ceremony has been sensationalized and misunderstood, often focusing solely on the element of physical sacrifice. In reality, the sun dance was a massive week-long ceremony of world renewal. The entire nation would gather, reaffirming their bonds with each other and with the cosmos. It was a time of intense prayer, fasting, and dancing. The central pole of the sun dance lodge was seen as the axis of the universe, connecting the earth and the sky. The entire ceremony was an offering, a collective prayer for the well-being of the people, the health of the bison herds, and the continuation of life. For some individuals who had made a vow, the ceremony did involve a profound physical sacrifice, a piercing of the skin as an offering of the only thing they truly owned, their own body sin, an ultimate act of humility and gratitude. It was not self-torture, it was a deeply personal and powerful prayer made manifest. Spiritual leaders, often called medicine men or holy men, Wichashawakang, were not priests in an organized hierarchy. They were individualsmen and women who, through their visions, their training, and their character, were recognized as having a special connection to the sacred. They were healers, prophets, and keepers of the most sacred rituals and knowledge. Their power came not from an institution, but from direct personal experience and the recognition of their community. This spiritual framework gave life meaning, purpose, and coherence. It provided a moral compass, a guide for right action, and a source of profound comfort and strength. It was a worldview that fostered humility, gratitude, and a deep, abiding respect for the intricate web of life. It wasn't a set of beliefs to be debated. It was a reality to be lived every single day. The stereotype of plains tribes as isolated, self-sufficient units, perpetually at war with their immediate neighbors, is another cinematic fiction that crumbles under the slightest scrutiny. The Great Plains were not an isolated island. They were a continental crossroads, the hub of a vast and ancient network of trade and communication that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic. It was a complex international marketplace, complete with its own lingua franca and established centers of commerce. Long before the arrival of Europeans, a vibrant trade existed. The horticultural tribes of the Missouri River, like the Mandan and Arikara, lived in large, permanent earth lodge villages and grew massive surpluses of corn, beans, squash, and tobacco. They were the agricultural heartland, and their villages became major trade centers. The nomadic hunting tribes, like the Lakota and Cheyenne, would travel to these centers to trade the products of the plains-dried bison meat, fine tanned robes, and tallow for the agricultural goods they couldn't produce themselves. It was a classic exchange between producers of raw materials and producers of finished goods. But the network extended far, far beyond this regional exchange. Archaeological evidence shows that materials traveled astounding distances. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for making razor-sharp arrowheads and tools, was quarried in what is now Yellowstone National Park and traded as far east as Ohio. Seashells from the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific coast, used for decoration and ceremony, are found in burial sites all across the plains. Copper came from the Great Lakes region. Turquoise came from the southwest. This wasn't a random, trickle-down process. It was a deliberate, long-distance trade carried on by seasoned merchants and diplomats. The arrival of the horse in the 17th and 18th centuries supercharged this network, acting as the plains equivalent of the invention of the steam engine. The horse made it possible to travel farther, faster, and to transport much larger quantities of goods. It intensified the bison hunt, creating even greater surpluses of hides and meat for trade. The arrival of European goods on the peripheral pots, knives, guns, and beads added another layer of complexity and desire to the existing system. Tribes who had first access to European goods, like the Crow or the Cheyenne, could act as powerful middlemen, trading those goods to more remote tribes at a significant markup. How did these diverse nations, speaking dozens of mutually unintelligible languages, conduct such complex business? They used one of the most remarkable and beautiful communication systems ever devised. Plain Sign Language, PSL. PSL was not a simple pantomime. It was a fully developed, complex language with its own grammar and syntax, capable of expressing nuanced and abstract ideas. A Lakota speaker could have a detailed conversation about politics, philosophy, or trade terms with a Crow or a Kiowa speaker, neither understanding a word of the other's spoken language, using only the graceful, fluid movements of their hands. It was the universal language of the plains, the diplomatic and commercial lingua franca, that made this entire continental system possible. Major trade fairs were held at specific times and places, like the great gatherings at the Mandan villages or in the Shoshone country of the Rocky Mountains. These were like massive international conventions, where thousands of people from numerous nations would gather for weeks at a time. They weren't just about business. They were huge social events, a time for feasting, dancing, holding ceremonies, arranging marriages, and exchanging information. News from across the continent would flow through these hubs. A man in a Lakota camp could hear about events happening 1,000 miles away in the Spanish Southwest, the news having traveled up the chain of trade and communication. This intricate web of connection demonstrates, once again, the sophistication of plains societies. They were not isolated, primitive bands. They were savvy, cosmopolitan actors in a dynamic, continent-wide system of economy and information exchange. They were traders, diplomats, and innovators who built and maintained a world far larger and more interconnected than we have ever been led to believe. The great summer gatherings, with their massive communal hunts, sprawling camp circles, and vibrant ceremonies, were the spectacular, high-energy phase of the Plains year. But they were only half the story. As the days grew shorter and the first bite of cold entered the air, a profound transformation took place. The great nations would break apart, a process as natural and necessary as the turning of the leaves. The time of the winter camp had arrived. Survival on the plains in winter, one of the harshest climates on Earth, demanded a different strategy. It was a time to go small, to seek shelter, and to live on the wealth accumulated during the bountiful summer and fall. The massive national encampments, sometimes numbering thousands of people, would dissolve. The nation would fragment back into its constituent parts, the tiosh pies or bands, which would then travel to their own traditional sheltered wintering spots. These locations were not chosen at random. They were prime real estate, carefully selected for their unique microclimates. A perfect winter camp was typically located in a deep, wooded river valley, often on the south side of a hill or bluff. This provided a crucial trifecta of resources: shelter from the relentless, soul-crushing winter winds, access to water from the river, even if it meant chopping through ice, and, most importantly, a plentiful supply of cottonwood trees. Cottonwood was the winter lifeblood. Its bark provided essential emergency fodder for the precious horse herds when snow covered the grass, and the dead wood provided fuel for the tipi fires. Life in the winter camp was slower, more intimate, and more inwardly focused. The tipis were pitched closer together for mutual warmth and protection. The pace of work changed. With no major hunts or migrations to plan, the focus shifted to maintenance, craft, and social and spiritual life. Men would spend their days repairing their hunting gear, making new arrows, and caring for the horses. The winter was a time of intense craft production. A man might spend weeks carefully crafting a single, powerful bow from a piece of ash or Osage orange. For women, it was a time to work on their larger projects. They would tan the last of the hides from the fall hunt and spend the long evenings and stormy days doing intricate quill work or beadwork, creating the beautiful clothing and regalia that would be displayed at the next summer's gatherings. The winter camp was a hive of quiet, focused creativity. But more than anything, winter was the season of the mind and the spirit. With the people gathered closely together for months on end, it was the primary time for storytelling. Every evening, families would gather in a tipi, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the hide walls, and listen to the elders. This was when the great cultural narratives were passed on. The children would hear the creation stories, the epic sagas of their heroes, the hilarious and cautionary tales of the trickster, Iktomi. They would learn their history, their values, and their place in the universe, not from a book, but from the living voice of their grandfather. It was the tribe's university, in session every night. It was also a time for games and socializing. Games of skill and chance were played inside the tipis, and when the weather allowed, men and boys would hold sliding contests on the frozen rivers using sleds made of bison ribs. It was a time for strengthening the bonds of kinship through constant, close contact. Life wasn't easy. A particularly harsh winter, a hard winter, could be devastating. Blizzards could last for days, trapping people in their tipis. If the stored food ran out, or if the horse herd was lost to the cold or a wolf pack, starvation was a real and terrifying possibility. The oral histories of the people, their winter counts, often marked years by these catastrophic events. The year we ate our horses. But the winter camp was also a testament to their resilience and brilliant planning. It was a strategic retreat, a time for resting, regrouping, and consolidating the gains of the summer. It was a time for reaffirming the bonds of family and community in the warm, close press of the tipi, while the wind howled outside. It was the long, cold nap that allowed the people to emerge in the spring, renewed and ready once again to follow the sun and the bison across the greening plains. So, we come to the end of our journey tonight, back from the vast, wind-swept plains of the past. We've dismantled the caricature of the simple, savage life and replaced it with something far more complex, more sophisticated, and infinitely more human. We've seen that life in a plains clan wasn't a primitive struggle for survival. It was a finely calibrated dance of existence, built on a social operating system of kinship, so powerful it made modern social networks look like flimsy novelties. It was a life lived in architectural marvels of mobile engineering, powered by a walking department store of an animal, the bison, whose every part was used with reverence and genius. This was a world where women were the economic and domestic bedrock of society, where justice meant healing instead of punishing, and where children learned the art of living through a lifelong, community-wide apprenticeship. It was a civilization governed not by written laws, but by an intricate understanding of honor and the sacred. A world connected by continent, spanning trade routes and a universal language of the hands. Their lives followed a rhythm of seasonal expansion and contraction, of summer's grand public ceremony and winter's intimate firelit stories. Passion existed, absolutely, but it was woven into a tapestry of responsibility to one's kin. Romance wasn't private. It was a project that involved your entire tioshpai. Your worth wasn't measured by what you owned, but by what you gave away. Your strength wasn't just in your arm, but in your ability to be a good relative. To call this history boring is to miss the point entirely. The story of these cultures is one of the great epics of human adaptation and ingenuity. It's a story of a people who created a rich, sustainable, and deeply meaningful way of life in one of the world's most challenging environments, and did so for thousands of years. It's a beautiful, windswept, emotionally messy drama. And perhaps most profoundly of all, it wasn't about being perfect. It was about seeking balance between the individual and the community, between humanity and nature, between the physical world and the great mystery that animates it all. They did it with courage, with flair, and with a deep and abiding understanding of their place in the universe. And though that world may be gone, its echoes can still be heard, if you listen closely, in the whisper of the wind across the long grass of the northern plains. Sleep well.